Hey guys, tonight we begin with the corseted misery and decorative imprisonment of being a Victorian noble princess. The polished bird in a gilded cage who gave us fainting couches, elaborate etiquette, and the delicate art of silently screaming into a teacup while being told not to slouch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you think you'd thrive as a Victorian princess? Adorable. Honestly, like a kitten trying to curtsy with £100 dress and no concept of personal freedom. Congratulations, darling. You've won the genetic lottery, or so everyone keeps telling you. Born into the upper echelons of Victorian society, you are a princess. Not of blood, perhaps, but of breeding, wealth, and social standing. Your father is a duke, an earl, or some other titled gentleman whose ancestors killed the right people at the right time centuries ago. Your mother is a lady who has never seen a kitchen, never touched a coin, and faints at the mention of anything more strenuous than embroidery. You should feel blessed. You should feel grateful. You should feel like the luckiest girl in all of England. Instead, you feel like a prisoner in petticoats. Your day begins not when you wake up, but when your lady's maid decides you should wake up. Privacy. What a quaint, foreign concept. From the moment you draw your first breath each morning until you exhale your last sigh each night, you are never, ever alone. The idea of solitude is as alien to your existence as the concept of earning your own living. Margaret, your lady's maid, a woman whose entire purpose in life is to ensure you remain incapable of dressing yourself, enters your chamber at precisely 7 o'clock. Not because you've requested this, mind you, but because society has decreed that ladies of quality must maintain a schedule more rigid than a military campaign. She draws back the heavy velvet curtains with the reverence of someone unveiling a sacred relic, flooding your room with the grey, depressing light of another London morning. Good morning, my lady, she chirps with the forced cheer of someone whose livelihood depends on your continued existence. Shall we begin with the usual preparations? The usual preparations. As if you're a theatrical production that requires hours of staging before the curtain can rise, which, in a way, you are. First comes the washing ritual. Not a simple splash of water and soap. Oh no, that would be far too pedestrian for someone of your breeding. Instead, you're subjected to an elaborate ceremony involving rose water imported from Bulgaria, French milled soaps that cost more than most families spend on food in a month, and a series of scrubs, rinses, and treatments that would make a Roman emperor weep with envy. But here's the delicious irony. All this cleanliness is designed to make you utterly helpless. You cannot wash your own back because your corset, once applied, will make such flexibility impossible. You cannot reach your own feet because ladies of quality do not bend at the waist. You cannot even wash your own hair because the elaborate styles required of your station demand professional assistance. You are being systematically taught that your own body is a foreign country you're not qualified to govern. Then comes the real torture, the corset. The corset. That marvel of Victorian engineering designed by men who clearly believed that women's internal organs were merely suggestions. Margaret approaches with the whalebone contraption as if it were a medieval torture device. Which, let's be honest, it essentially is. The corset isn't just underwear, it's a philosophical statement. It declares to the world that women are inherently flawed creatures whose natural shape requires aggressive architectural intervention. Deep breath, my lady, Margaret warns, as if you haven't been through this daily ritual for the past 10 years of your life. You can play sucking in air like a drowning woman, because in about 30 seconds, breathing will become a luxury you can barely afford. Margaret begins the lacing process with the efficiency of a sailor rigging a ship. Pull, tighten, pull, tighten. Each tug draws your waist smaller, your ribcage more compressed, your breathing more shallow. 18 inches, that's the goal. 18 inches of waist, as if you were a decorative vase rather than a human being with internal organs that require space to function. Never mind that your natural waist is 22 inches. Nature, apparently, is no match for fashion. Never mind that the compression makes you light-headed and occasionally causes you to faint at inopportune moments. Never mind that you can't take a full breath, can't eat a proper meal, can't move with anything resembling natural grace. You are not meant to be comfortable. You are meant to be ornamental. The corset serves another purpose beyond mere aesthetics. It ensures your complete physical helplessness. Try to bend over in a properly laced corset. Go ahead, try. You'll discover that such simple human movements are now impossible. You cannot pick up something you've dropped. You cannot tie your own shoes. You cannot reach anything above your head or below your knees without assistance. This isn't an accident. This is by design. Over the corset goes the chemise, a thin layer of cotton that exists primarily to protect your corset from your skin, because heaven forbid your actual body should come into direct contact with your undergarments. Then comes the bustle, that architectural marvel designed to thrust your posterior into a position that would make a shelf weep with envy. The bustle is not about beauty. It's about creating a silhouette so exaggerated, so completely divorced from human anatomy, that you become a walking advertisement for mankind's triumph over nature. Next come the petticoats. Not one, not two, but 6 separate layers of starched cotton and silk, each one heavier than the last. By the time Margaret finishes with the undergarments, you're carrying approximately 15 pounds of fabric and infrastructure. 15 pounds! You could carry a small child with less effort than it takes to support your own underwear. But we're not finished. Oh no, we're just getting started. The stockings must be silk, naturally, and must be held up by garters that cut into your thighs with the dedication of a zealous inquisitor. The shoes, delicate little slippers with heels high enough to ensure that walking becomes a precarious bollet of potential disaster. God forbid you should have sturdy, practical footwear. That would suggest you might actually need to walk somewhere with purpose, and ladies of quality do not walk with purpose. They glide, they float, they occasionally perambulate in a decorative manner around drawing rooms and gardens. Finally, the dress itself. Today's selection. Because you do not choose your own clothing, Margaret chooses it based on a complex algorithm of social expectations, weather conditions, and the likelihood of encountering various members of society. Is a confection of emerald silk with approximately 14 yards of fabric in the skirt alone. 14 yards! You could upholster a small carriage with the amount of material required to make you presentable to society. The sleeves are so tight that raising your arms above shoulder height becomes an impossibility. The neckline is so high that turning your head requires the coordination of your entire torso. The waistline sits at precisely the point where your corset has compressed your ribcage into an unnatural configuration, ensuring that the dress and your undergarments work in perfect harmony to restrict every possible movement. But wait, there's more! The gloves. White kid leather that must be changed 3 times a day and must never, under any circumstances, touch anything that might soil them. Which raises the obvious question, what is the point of wearing gloves that cannot touch anything? The answer, of course, is that the gloves exist to demonstrate that your hands are so purely ornamental that they require protection from the very air around them. Then comes the jewellery. Not because you particularly want to wear jewellery, but because a lady of your station must display the appropriate amount of portable wealth at all times. The emeralds today, a necklace, earrings, bracelet, and brooch that together represent more money than most people will see in their entire lifetimes. They're beautiful, certainly, but they're also heavy, uncomfortable, and serve as a constant reminder that you are not a person so much as a walking display case for your family's prosperity. Your hair requires 45 minutes of Margaret's undivided attention. 45 minutes to create an elaborate sculpture of curls, braids, and ornamental combs that will remain untouchable for the rest of the day. You cannot run your fingers through your hair. You cannot rest your head against anything. You cannot even scratch your scalp without destroying hours of work. Your hair has been transformed from a natural part of your body into an architectural achievement that must be preserved at all costs. Finally, the hat. Because ladies never, ever appear in public without proper headwear. Today's selection features a brim wide enough to provide shade for a small family, decorated with enough feathers to suggest that several exotic birds died for your fashion. The hat is pinned to your elaborate hairstyle, with hat pins sharp enough to double as weapons, which, given the circumstances of your life, might not be entirely accidental. And there you stand, after 2 hours of preparation, ready to face the day. Except you're not ready for anything. You can barely move. You can barely breathe. You cannot sit down without assistance, cannot stand up without help, cannot walk faster than a funeral dirge, and cannot bend in any direction without risking structural collapse. You have been transformed from a human being into a decorative object, a piece of living furniture designed to ornament drawing rooms and ballrooms. You are beautiful, certainly, elegant, undoubtedly, and completely, utterly, magnificently helpless. This is what they call privilege. Now that you've been properly assembled for public display, it's time to begin your daily sentence of leisure. You might think that being wealthy and titled means you get to do whatever you want. How charmingly naive. Being a Victorian noble princess means you get to do exactly what society expects you to do, when society expects you to do it, and precisely how society has decreed it should be done. Your first stop is the morning room, where you will take breakfast. Not because you're hungry. The corset has compressed your stomach to approximately the size of a walnut, but because taking breakfast in the morning room at precisely 8:30 is what ladies of quality do. The meal itself is a study in frustration. Kippers, too messy to eat in a dress worth more than a carriage. Eggs. The risk of spillage on white gloves is unacceptable. Toast. The crumbs might disturb the perfect arrangement of your bodice, so you nibble. You pick. You take delicate sips of tea and pretend that consuming enough nutrition to keep a sparrow alive is perfectly adequate for a grown woman. Meanwhile, your brother Charles, dear, stupid Charles, shovels down a breakfast that could feed a small village while discussing his plans to spend the day shooting things or gambling away the family fortune. Because he's a man, and men are permitted to have appetites. After this feast of starvation, you retire to the drawing room for the morning's activities. Activities is perhaps too generous a term. What you're about to engage in is more accurately described as the systematic elimination of time until death provides blessed relief. First on the agenda, correspondence. Not the sort of correspondence where you might express actual thoughts or feelings, heaven forbid, but the ritualized exchange of meaningless pleasantries with other women trapped in identical circumstances. Lady Pemberton has invited you to tea on Thursday. The Duchess of Marlborough's daughter is engaged to some Earl's second son. Mrs. Worthington's roses are doing splendidly this season, thank you for asking. Each letter must be written on the finest stationery, in the most perfect handwriting, using language so formalized and empty of genuine content that it might as well be in code. You cannot express actual opinions, cannot discuss anything more stimulating than the weather or the health of mutual acquaintances, and certainly cannot acknowledge that you possess a functioning brain capable of independent thought. The writing process is itself a study in manufactured helplessness. Your writing desk, an exquisite piece of furniture that costs more than most people's annual income, is positioned so that you must sit with perfect posture while writing. The chair provides no back support, ensuring that your corset, compressed spine bears the full weight of maintaining proper posture. The inkwell is positioned so that reaching it requires careful coordination to avoid staining your dress. Even the act of correspondence has been designed to be as uncomfortable and inefficient as possible. After an hour of this intellectual starvation, it's time for needlework. Needlework, the great Victorian solution to the problem of women having too much time and too much mental capacity. Give them tiny, repetitive tasks that require enormous amounts of time to complete and produce objects of minimal practical value. It's genius, really. Today you're working on a cushion cover featuring a pastoral scene of shepherdesses and lambs. The irony is not lost on you that you, a woman with no more practical skills than these fictional shepherdesses, are spending your days creating decorative objects, celebrating the simple. Pastoral life you'll never be permitted to experience. The needlework itself is exquisite, naturally. Your governess spent years drilling you in the precise stitching techniques required to create museum-quality embroidery. But here's the cruel joke. The skills you've mastered are completely useless for anything practical. You can create elaborate decorative stitching that would make professional seamstresses weep with admiration. But you cannot sew a simple seam, cannot mend a tear, cannot create anything remotely useful. Your embroidery skills are like your French conversation skills, your watercolor painting skills, and your piano playing skills, impressive, refined, and utterly disconnected from any practical application. You have been trained to be accomplished without being capable, skilled without being useful, educated without being prepared for anything resembling real life. As you work on the eternal cushion cover, your mind wanders to the world beyond the drawing room windows. Through the lace curtains, you can see servants hurrying about their business, tradesmen making deliveries, children playing in the square. All of them have purpose, direction, something to accomplish beyond the mere passage of time. You envy them. God help you, you actually envy the scullery maid who spends her days scrubbing pots, because at least her work serves a purpose. At least she can see the results of her labour. At least she goes to bed each night knowing she has accomplished something more meaningful than advancing 3 inches on a decorative cushion that will spend the rest of its existence gathering dust on a chair that no one is permitted to sit on. But such thoughts are dangerous. Such thoughts suggest dissatisfaction with your divinely ordained position in society. Such thoughts hint at the radical notion that you might prefer to have some control over your own existence. So you push them down, bury them beneath layers of social conditioning and practiced resignation, and continue your stitching. The morning drags on. 11 o'clock arrives with the regularity of a prison bell, announcing the next scheduled activity receiving callers, because ladies of quality cannot simply exist in peaceful solitude. No, you must be available for social inspection by other ladies of quality, all of whom are equally bored, equally constrained, and equally desperate for some form of human connection that extends beyond the boundaries of acceptable conversation. Lady Whitmore arrives first, trailing her unmarried daughter like a general leading troops into battle. The daughter, poor creature, is perhaps 19 and already showing the glazed expression of someone who has realized that her entire future consists of drawing room conversations and needlework. Lady Whitmore herself possesses the brittle cheerfulness of a woman who has spent 30 years pretending that her life is deeply fulfilling. "My dear girl, how lovely you look today," Lady Whitmore declares, settling her considerable bulk into a chair that creaks ominously under the weight of her bustles and petticoats. That shade of green is particularly becoming. And so it begins. The ritual exchange of compliments, observations about the weather, discussions of mutual acquaintances, and carefully coded assessments of marriage prospects. Every word is scripted by social convention. Every response is predetermined by the rigid rules of polite conversation. You might as well be performing a play that has been running for decades with the same tired dialogue and predictable plot developments. The conversation turns to the upcoming season's social events. Lady Pemberton's ball promises to be the event of the season. The Duke of Rutland's nephew will be in attendance, single, titled, and possessed of adequate fortune to make him an acceptable prospect for some fortunate young lady. The Ashworth girl has made quite an advantageous match with Lord Blackwood's second son. Marriage. It always comes back to marriage. Not love, not companionship, not even personal compatibility. Marriage as a business transaction, a social arrangement, a solution to the problem of what to do with daughters who cannot be expected to support themselves. You listen to these discussions with the fascination of someone watching her own execution being planned. More callers arrive. Mrs. Worthington with her sharp tongue and sharper assessment of everyone's social standing. The Mrs. Caldwell. 2 spinsters who have somehow managed to avoid marriage and now spend their time monitoring everyone else's romantic prospects with the dedication of military strategists, Lady Ashford, whose primary accomplishment in life appears to be producing children with clockwork regularity, while maintaining a figure that suggests she has never eaten a full meal. The conversation flows like treacle, sweet, sticky, and utterly devoid of nutritional value. Topics are introduced, discussed to the point of complete exhaustion, and then abandoned in favor of new subjects equally trivial and meaningless. The weather receives more analytical attention than most philosophical treatises. The cut of ladies sew, and so's new dress is dissected with the thoroughness of a medical examination. Meanwhile, you sit in your chair like a beautiful ornament, contributing your scheduled responses to the conversational ritual. Indeed, how fascinating. What a lovely idea. Your actual thoughts, assuming you still have any after years of this intellectual starvation, remain locked away in the prison of your skull, where they slowly atrophy from lack of use. Hours pass. The hands of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece creep forward with the speed of geological formation. Each tick seems to echo through your compressed ribcage like a death knell. This is your life. This is your purpose. This is the grand destiny that your noble birth has secured for you. To sit in drawing rooms making meaningless conversation with other women whose lives are equally empty, equally constrained, equally wasted. The callers eventually depart, trailing their own elaborate costumes and empty conversations behind them like the wake of particularly ornamental ships. You are left alone with your needlework, your correspondence, and the crushing weight of another day that must be somehow survived before you can be disassembled by Margaret and stored away until tomorrow's performance. But solitude, even temporary solitude, is too dangerous to be permitted. Almost immediately, your mother appears to discuss the day's social obligations, review your performance during the morning's calls, and plan tomorrow's equally meaningless activities. Because God forbid you should have 5 minutes to think your own thoughts or contemplate your own existence. This is leisure. This is privilege. This is the enviable lifestyle that everyone assumes you should be grateful to possess. You would trade it all for 1 day of honest work, 1 moment of genuine purpose, 1 hour of being treated like a human being rather than a decorative object. But such trades are not permitted in the aristocratic market. You have been born to ornament, not to live. An ornamentation, as everyone knows, must be kept in perfect condition and never, ever allowed to think for itself. Long before you reached the age of drawing room imprisonment, your fate was sealed by what passed for education in the rarefied circles of Victorian nobility.
Education!
What a wonderfully deceptive term for the systematic process of ensuring that young ladies of quality remain perpetually unqualified for anything resembling independent existence. Your formal education began at age 5 under the watchful eye of Miss Pemberton, a governess whose qualifications included an unshakable belief that knowledge was dangerous in female hands, and that the primary purpose of learning was to make young ladies more attractive to potential husbands. Miss Pemberton had herself been educated at one of those exclusive establishments where young women of good family were trained to become professional governesses, a career path that basically involved teaching other people's daughters to be as serious as oneself. The curriculum was carefully designed to create the perfect Victorian lady, accomplished enough to demonstrate breeding, ignorant enough to remain helpless, and educated just sufficiently to appreciate her own intellectual limitations. It was a masterpiece of social engineering disguised as pedagogy. Languages, naturally, were essential. French, because no lady of quality could be considered properly educated without the ability to make polite conversation in the language of diplomacy and fashion. But not just any French. Oh no, that would be far too practical. You learned the French of drawing rooms and opera houses, the French of romantic poetry and fashionable novels, the French that would allow you to discuss the weather with visiting dignitaries or compliment a hostess on her choice of menu. You did not learn the French that might allow you to read Voltaire's Critiques of Society or Rousseau's revolutionary ideas about government or any of the philosophical works that were reshaping European thought. Such texts were deemed inappropriate for feminine minds. Instead, you memorized conversational phrases about embroidery, recipes, and the proper care of household pets. German was included because it was considered intellectually rigorous, a language that would demonstrate your mental capacity while remaining safely disconnected from any practical application. You learned to read Goethe's romantic poetry, but were carefully steered away from his scientific writings. You could discuss German literature with charming superficiality, but were never exposed to the political and philosophical movements sweeping through German universities. Italian was the language of art and music, and you were taught just enough to appreciate opera and discuss Renaissance paintings with the shallow sophistication expected of a cultured lady. You could identify the major works of Italian masters and make appropriate comments about their technical excellence, but you knew nothing of the historical contexts that produced these works, nothing of the social and political upheavals that shaped Italian culture. Mathematics was where the real comedy began. You were taught arithmetic sufficient to manage household accounts, addition, subtraction, and just enough multiplication to calculate the cost of tea services and embroidery supplies. Anything more complex was considered both unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Algebra, geometry, calculus. These were masculine subjects that might overtax your delicate feminine brain and interfere with your natural inclination toward domestic concerns. The reasoning, as Miss Pemberton explained with the confidence of someone who had never questioned a single assumption in her life, was that advanced mathematics might make you argumentative. Women who understood complex mathematical concepts might begin to question other things. Social arrangements, for instance, or the logic of their own subordinate position in society. Far better to keep mathematical education simple, practical, and safely disconnected from any broader intellectual applications. History was perhaps the most carefully sanitized subject in your curriculum. You learned about kings and queens, battles and treaties, the rise and fall of dynasties. But it was history stripped of all political analysis, all social criticism, all examination of power structures or class relations. You could recite the dates of major wars and the names of royal succession, but you learned nothing about why these events occurred or what they revealed about human nature and social organization. The French Revolution, for instance, was presented as a cautionary tale about what happens when the lower classes forget their proper place in society. You learned that it was a period of unfortunate excess and regrettable violence, but you were never exposed to the ideas that inspired it, concepts of natural rights, social contracts, or the possibility that political authority might derive from the consent of the governed rather than divine appointment. English history was presented as a triumphant march toward the glorious present, with particular emphasis on the wisdom and benevolence of the current social order. You learned to admire the stability of British institutions, the wisdom of gradual change, and the natural fitness of the aristocracy to govern. Any historical episodes that might suggest flaws in this system were either omitted entirely or presented as temporary aberrations, quickly corrected by the inherent good sense of the British people. Science was the most strictly limited subject of all. You were taught enough natural philosophy to make intelligent conversation about flowers, birds, and the weather. You could identify common plants, describe the habits of various animals, and discuss the changing seasons with appropriate poetic sensibility. This was science as decoration, nature study as an extension of artistic appreciation. You were not taught about the revolutionary scientific discoveries reshaping human understanding of the natural world. Darwin's theories, the principles of physics, the new chemical discoveries, all of this was deemed inappropriate for feminine study. The reasoning was partly that such subjects were too intellectually demanding, but more fundamentally that scientific thinking might encourage you to question received wisdom and traditional authority. After all, if you learn to think scientifically about the natural world, you might begin to apply scientific reasoning to the social world. You might start to question whether the subordination of women was really a natural law or merely a human convention. You might wonder whether aristocratic privilege was divinely ordained or simply a historical accident. Such questions were dangerous to the social order and therefore had no place in feminine education. Literature was your strongest subject, but even here the curriculum was carefully curated to reinforce proper attitudes and expectations. You read extensively in English poetry and fiction, but only works that celebrated appropriate feminine virtues and reinforced traditional social values. Jane Austen was perfect, witty, elegant, and ultimately conservative in her social vision. The Romantic poets were acceptable in small doses, as long as their political radicalism was ignored in favour of their aesthetic achievements. You were not permitted to read novels that might give you inconvenient ideas about women's capabilities or social arrangements. No George Sand, whose novels suggested that women might be capable of passion and independence. No Mary Wollstonecraft, whose writings proposed the radical notion that women deserved education and political rights. no contemporary works that examined the social problems of industrial England or questioned the justice of existing class arrangements. Your literary education was designed to make you a charming conversationalist who could quote appropriate verses and discuss fashionable novels without ever encountering ideas that might disturb your acceptance of your social position. You became, well, read in the narrowest possible sense, familiar with a carefully selected canon that would allow you to display cultural refinement while remaining safely insulated from intellectual challenge. Art and music rounded out your accomplishments, but again with careful attention to maintaining appropriate boundaries. You learned to paint watercolors of flowers, landscapes, and domestic scenes. The technique was demanding. Miss Pemberton insisted on professional standards of execution, but the subjects were limited to safe, decorative themes. You were not encouraged to paint portraits that might require you to study human psychology, or urban scenes that might expose you to social realities, or historical subjects that might require serious research and analysis. Music was similar. You became an accomplished pianist, capable of performing complex classical pieces and popular ballads with genuine skill. But your repertoire was carefully selected for its emotional safety. You played Mozart's elegant sonatas and Bach's mathematical perfection, music that demonstrated technical mastery without challenging social conventions. You were not exposed to the more revolutionary musical developments of your time, composers who were using their art to express political dissent or social criticism. The goal of all this education was to make you accomplished without being intellectual, refined without being independent, cultured without being critical. You were being trained to ornament drawing rooms and dinner parties, to provide appropriate responses to conversational gambit without ever initiating serious discussion, to demonstrate your family's wealth and sophistication without ever questioning the system that made such display possible. By the time Miss Pemberton declared your education complete, you had become a masterpiece of Victorian feminine accomplishment. You could speak 3 languages without saying anything meaningful in any of them. You could discuss literature without encountering dangerous ideas, appreciate art without questioning its social context, and perform music without expressing personal emotion. You had been taught to think just enough to be interesting, and not enough to be threatening. The tragedy was that you possessed a genuinely intelligent mind. Under different circumstances, with different teachers and different social expectations, you might have become a scholar, a scientist, an artist, or a writer. You had the intellectual capacity to understand complex ideas, to engage with serious questions, to contribute meaningfully to human knowledge and culture. Instead, your intelligence had been carefully channeled into socially acceptable accomplishments that served no purpose beyond demonstrating your marriage ability. You had been educated to be ignorant, trained to be helpless, and refined into a state of perfect uselessness. This was considered the finest education money could buy for a young lady of quality. Your parents were proud of your accomplishments, society approved of your refinement, and potential suitors would appreciate your combination of cultural sophistication and intellectual tractability. You, meanwhile, had begun to suspect that your beautiful, accomplished, utterly empty education had prepared you for nothing more meaningful than a lifetime of ornamental existence. But such suspicions were dangerous, and you had been too well educated to voice them, even to yourself. The perfect Victorian lady was not supposed to think such thoughts, and your education had succeeded in making you very nearly perfect indeed. At 18, you officially entered what polite society called the season, but which you had come to think of as the marriage market, a sophisticated system for the trading of young women like prize livestock, where bloodlines mattered more than personality and financial arrangements trumped any consideration of affection or compatibility. Your debut was planned with the strategic precision of a military campaign. Your mother, suddenly transformed from a languid creature of drawing rooms into a general marshalling forces for battle, spent months preparing for your presentation to society. The dress alone required 6 months of planning and execution. A confection of white silk and Brussels lace that cost more than most families earned in several years, designed to advertise your family's wealth while emphasizing your youth, purity, and complete inexperience with the world. The season was an exhausting marathon of social events, each one a carefully orchestrated opportunity for young ladies to be inspected by potential husbands and their families. Balls, dinner parties, garden parties, the theatre, the opera, gallery openings. Every social gathering became a marketplace where your value was assessed by men who viewed marriage as a business transaction requiring careful evaluation of assets and liabilities. Your assets were obvious enough: a substantial dowry, excellent bloodlines, appropriate education, and what society magazines politely termed considerable personal attractions. You were beautiful, accomplished, and possessed the kind of refined helplessness that Victorian gentlemen found irresistible. You could make charming conversation without expressing controversial opinions, display cultural refinement without intellectual pretension, and demonstrate feminine accomplishments without threatening masculine authority. Your liabilities were less obvious, but equally important in the calculations of prospective suitors. You possessed no independent fortune, no practical skills, and no experience with anything resembling real world challenges. You had been raised to be completely dependent on masculine protection and financial support. In the marriage market, this helplessness was both asset and liability, attractive to men who wanted decorative wives, but expensive for men who had to support such ornamental creatures for the rest of their lives. The inspection process was both subtle and humiliating. At balls, young men would approach your mother to request introductions, evaluating you with the same calculating attention they might give to horses they were considering purchasing. They assessed your appearance, your conversation, your family connections, and your probable fertility with the clinical detachment of livestock appraisers. Dancing provided opportunities for closer examination. During the approved physical contact of a waltz or quadrille, potential suitors could evaluate your grace, your responsiveness to masculine guidance, and your ability to follow their lead without question. The conversation during these dances was carefully scripted by social convention. Compliments on your appearance, observations about the weather, discussion of mutual acquaintances, but the real communication was nonverbal. Were you sufficiently submissive? Did you defer appropriately to masculine authority? Could you be trusted to reflect credit on a husband's social position without causing embarrassment through independent thought or action? These were the questions being answered during those seemingly innocent social interactions. The most eligible bachelor of your first season was Lord Pemberton, a man of 30, 5 with estates in Yorkshire, a seat in Parliament, and the kind of distinguished greying at his temples that suggested maturity and reliability. He was handsome in the way that comes with good breeding and expensive tailoring, possessed adequate fortune to maintain a wife in appropriate style, and enjoyed the kind of social position that would elevate any woman fortunate enough to secure his proposal. He was also, you gradually realized, one of the most profoundly boring human beings you had ever encountered. Lord Pemberton's conversation consisted entirely of observations about estate management, political developments that affected his business interests, and the social activities of people he considered important. He had opinions about everything and curiosity about nothing. He spoke to you as if you were a charming, but essentially empty, headed ornament whose primary function was to provide an appreciative audience for his pronouncements about the world. During your third dance together, a waltz at Lady Ashford's ball that had half the ballroom watching with the keen interest of spectators at a horse race, Lord Pemberton began what was clearly a preliminary courtship conversation. "You are a remarkably accomplished young lady," he announced, guiding you through the steps with the confident authority of a man who had never questioned his right to lead. "Your mother tells me you speak French and German, paint watercolors, and play the piano with considerable skill. I have been fortunate in my education, my lord," you replied, delivering the appropriately modest response that years of social training had made automatic. "Excellent. A gentleman requires a wife who can do credit to his position in society, the ability to entertain guests appropriately, to manage household affairs with proper attention to detail, to provide suitable companionship without demanding undue attention. These are the qualities that make for successful marriages among people of our class." You noticed that he spoke of marriage as if it were a business arrangement requiring proper management, rather than a union between two people who might actually enjoy each other's company. You also noticed that his vision of wifely duties consisted entirely of services you would provide to enhance his comfort and social standing, with no apparent consideration of what you might receive in return beyond the privilege of bearing his name and spending his money. And children. Naturally, Lord Pemberton continued, his voice taking on the tone men used when discussing breeding programs for their livestock. A man in my position requires sons to inherit the estate and carry on the family name. I trust you understand the importance of this responsibility. The conversation continued in this vein for the remainder of the dance, with Lord Pemberton outlining his expectations for marriage with the thoroughness of someone dictating terms to a subordinate. You were expected to manage his household staff, entertain his political associates, produce his children, and provide decorative accompaniment to his social activities. In return, you would receive financial security, social position, and the satisfaction of fulfilling your natural feminine destiny. It was, by all social standards, an excellent prospect. Lord Pemberton was wealthy, titled, and respectable. Marriage to him would secure your future, elevate your social position, and fulfill your family's expectations for your successful establishment in life. Your mother was practically vibrating with excitement at the obvious interest he was showing in your suitability as a potential bride. You found yourself wondering if a lifetime in a convent might not be preferable. The problem wasn't that Lord Pemberton was cruel or obviously objectionable. He was simply the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the institution of marriage as practiced among the Victorian aristocracy. He wanted a wife the way he might want a particularly fine piece of furniture, beautiful, well-made, appropriately expensive, and designed to enhance the comfort and prestige of his domestic environment. Your thoughts, feelings, ambitions, and desires were no more relevant to his calculations than the personal preferences of the marble statues decorating his estate. You were a lovely object that would serve various useful functions while requiring minimal maintenance beyond the occasional new dress and regular feeding. Other suitors followed similar patterns, each one evaluating you according to the same criteria: beauty, breeding, docility, and the likelihood that you would enhance rather than complicate their lives. Mr. Ashworth, heir to a banking fortune, spent an entire dinner party discussion explaining his theories about the proper management of wives, comparing the process to training hunting dogs, requiring patience, consistency, and appropriate rewards for good behaviour. Captain Morrison, recently returned from military service in India, spoke of marriage as if he were planning another campaign, with strategic objectives to be achieved through proper deployment of resources. The few younger men who showed interest were hardly more appealing. They were looking for wives who would serve as decorative accessories to their social ambitions, charming hostesses who would advance their careers while remaining safely subordinate to masculine authority. Even the most romantically inclined among them spoke of love in terms that suggested you were expected to provide unlimited devotion in exchange for the privilege of being selected as their chosen ornament. The marriage market operated according to ruthlessly practical considerations disguised as romantic idealism. Your family was selling your beauty, breeding, and reproductive potential to the highest bidder, while potential purchasers evaluated your likely return on investment. The elaborate rituals of courtship, the flowers, the poetry, the gallant gestures, were merely marketing strategies designed to make the commercial transaction appear to be a matter of mutual affection. The most successful marriages among your social class were understood to be partnerships between families rather than unions between individuals. Your happiness was secondary to considerations of bloodline improvement, financial advantage, and social positioning. Love, if it developed at all, was expected to emerge gradually from shared interests and mutual respect, by which society meant your gradual adaptation to your husband's preferences and your growing appreciation for the security he provided. The women who had navigated this system successfully offered advice, with the condescending wisdom of survivors instructing new victims. Lady Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's sister-in-law, who had married advantageously 15 years earlier, took you aside at a garden party to share her insights into marital happiness. The secret, my dear, She confided with the authority of someone who had learned to find satisfaction in complete surrender, is to remember that a husband's comfort must always be your first consideration. Men are such simple creatures, really. They require admiration, excellent meals, well-managed households, and wives who never burden them with unnecessary emotional complications. Provide these things consistently, and you will find marriage quite agreeable. You wanted to ask what happened to wives who required admiration, intellectual stimulation, emotional connection, and partners who saw them as something more than household managers with decorative responsibilities. But such questions would have marked you as dangerously unsuited for marriage, so you nodded and murmured appropriate gratitude for her wisdom. The season dragged on with the inexorable momentum of a social avalanche. Each week brought new opportunities for inspection, evaluation, and the gradual narrowing of options as various suitors decided you were either suitable or unsuitable for their purposes. Your dance card filled with the names of men who regarded you as a potential acquisition. Your morning room overflowed with flowers from gentlemen expressing their appreciation of your charms. Your correspondence included increasingly frequent notes from potential suitors requesting permission to call upon your father to discuss their intentions. Through it all, you maintained the performance of a perfectly accomplished young lady delighted by the attention and grateful for the opportunities being presented. You smiled at compliments that treated you like a prize poodle. You engaged in conversations that assumed your complete intellectual vacancy. You accepted flowers from men who saw you as a decorative addition to their domestic arrangements. But privately, you began to understand that the marriage market was not offering you choices so much as different versions of the same fundamental transaction. Whether you married Lord Pemberton with his estates and political connections, Mr. Ashworth with his banking fortune, or Captain Morrison with his military pension, the essential arrangement would remain the same. You would trade your independence, your identity, and your potential for self-determination in exchange for financial security and social respectability. The men themselves were almost interchangeable in their expectations and assumptions. They wanted wives who would enhance their comfort, reflect their good taste, produce their children, and never, ever challenge their authority or compete for their attention. The specific details of income and social position mattered less than the fundamental understanding that marriage would transform you from an ornamental daughter into an ornamental wife, with no significant change in your essential function as a beautiful object designed to enhance masculine prestige. By the end of your first season, you had received 3 formal proposals of marriage, each one representing an excellent match by conventional standards. Your family was delighted by your success in attracting such eligible suitors. Society magazines praised your accomplishments in securing such advantageous offers. Other young ladies regarded you with the envious admiration due to someone who had clearly mastered the art of successful husband hunting. You felt like a piece of merchandise that had been successfully marketed to several competing buyers, all of whom were waiting for you to select which one would have the privilege of purchasing you. The choice, as your mother reminded you with increasing frequency, was really quite simple. All 3 suitors were respectable, wealthy, and capable of providing the kind of life that every young lady of quality was supposed to desire. Your personal preferences were secondary to considerations of practical advantage and family expectations. Marriage was not about personal fulfillment. Such notions were the silly romantic fantasies of novels and poetry. Marriage was about security, position, and the fulfillment of your natural feminine destiny as wife and mother. But lying in your bed at night, trapped in the elaborate nightgown that was as restrictive as your daytime costumes, you found yourself wondering what might have happened if you had been born into a different class, a different century, or simply a different gender. What if you could choose your own profession, pursue your own interests, form relationships based on mutual attraction rather than financial calculation? Such thoughts were dangerous, of course. Such thoughts suggested dissatisfaction with the natural order of things, ingratitude for the advantages of your birth, and the kind of restless ambition that made women unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. Good Victorian ladies did not entertain such notions. Good Victorian ladies were grateful for the protection and guidance of masculine authority. Good Victorian ladies understood that their highest happiness lay in serving others rather than pursuing selfish personal desires. You were not, apparently, a particularly good Victorian lady, but you were trapped in the life of one, and the marriage market was waiting for your decision with the patient inevitability of a very expensive and very beautiful prison. The golden cage was being prepared. All that remained was for you to walk inside and allow the door to be locked behind you, grateful for the privilege of such elegant confinement. Let us suppose, for the sake of this exquisite torture, that you have chosen your golden shackles. Perhaps you selected Lord Pemberton after all. His estates were impressive, his bloodlines impeccable, and your mother's tears of joy were rather touching. The wedding was everything a Victorian spectacle should be: elaborate, expensive, and designed to demonstrate that two families of appropriate standing were cementing their alliance through the traditional exchange of property. You being the primary asset changing hands. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of irony, standing before God and society in your white silk gown, white, naturally, to advertise your sexual ignorance. You promised to love, honour, and obey a man you barely knew, while he promised to provide for and protect a woman he regarded as a charming ornament requiring lifetime maintenance. The vows were beautiful, traditional, and bore no relationship whatsoever to the practical realities of aristocratic marriage. Your honeymoon was a brief interlude of travelling from one elegant prison to another, during which you discovered that your new husband's conversation was no more stimulating in private than it had been in public, and that the mysterious intimacies of marriage were every bit as awkward and uncomfortable as the whispered warnings of married women had suggested. But such personal disappointments were secondary to the larger transformation taking place. You were being translated from ornamental daughter to ornamental wife, with all the additional responsibilities such elevation entailed. Welcome to Pemberton Hall, your new home and the site of your domestic imprisonment for the foreseeable future. The hall is magnificent, naturally. 300 rooms of architectural splendour set in 2,000 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. It represents centuries of accumulated wealth and taste, each room a testament to the refined sensibilities of generations of Pemberton wives who have dedicated their lives to the maintenance of beautiful, useless perfection. Your predecessors have left you a legacy of exquisite responsibility. Every room must be maintained in museum-quality condition. Every piece of furniture must be perfectly positioned, perfectly clean, and perfectly protected from the degrading effects of actual use. Every decoration must be seasonally appropriate, aesthetically harmonious, and consistent with the standards established by previous generations of ladies who had nothing better to do than obsess over domestic perfection. You are now the mistress of this establishment, which sounds important until you realize that being mistress of a great house means serving as unpaid manager of an operation more complex than most commercial enterprises, with responsibilities more demanding than those of a hotel director, and authority more limited than that of a well-treated servant. Your day begins at 7 o'clock with a meeting with Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper whose actual authority far exceeds your own despite your theoretical position as her superior. Mrs. Henderson has been managing Pemberton Hall for 23 years, through 2 previous mistresses, and she regards you with the patient condescension reserved for young ladies who must be trained in their domestic duties. "Good morning, your ladyship," she says, settling her considerable bulk into the chair across from your writing desk with the confidence of someone who knows exactly who really runs this establishment. "Shall we review today's arrangements?" Today's arrangements, as if you had any meaningful choice in how your time will be spent. Your schedule has been determined by generations of precedent, seasonal requirements, and the inexorable demands of maintaining domestic perfection in a house large enough to accommodate a small village. First, the morning inspection of the principal rooms. This daily ritual requires you to walk through the drawing rooms, dining rooms, library, and reception halls, noting any deficiencies in cleaning, arrangement, or decoration that require correction. You are expected to notice if the flowers need refreshing, if the silver needs additional polishing, if any piece of furniture has been moved from its designated position. The inspection serves no practical purpose. Mrs. Henderson's staff is perfectly capable of maintaining the house without your supervision, and your untrained eye is unlikely to catch problems that professional servants have missed. But the inspection establishes your role as the person responsible for domestic perfection, ensuring that you feel accountable for maintaining standards you had no part in establishing and lack the expertise to evaluate properly. After the inspection comes the daily conference with cook regarding meals. Not because you have any particular knowledge of nutrition or food preparation. Your education carefully avoided such practical subjects, but because ladies of quality are expected to demonstrate their domestic competence through menu planning. Cook presents the day's proposed meals with the patience of someone explaining complicated matters to a well-meaning child. For breakfast, your ladyship, I thought perhaps the usual kippers, eggs, toast, and coffee for his lordship, with tea and toast for yourself. For luncheon, a light meal since you're expecting Lady Whitmore and her daughter. Perhaps a salmon salad with cucumber sandwiches and lemon cakes. And for dinner, given that his lordship is entertaining Mr. Ashworth and Captain Morrison, something more substantial. Roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, followed by the trifle that his lordship particularly enjoys. You nod and murmur approval, as if your opinion mattered. As if you possessed the knowledge to suggest improvements, as if anyone would pay attention if you expressed different preferences. The truth is that Cook has been preparing meals for the Pemberton family longer than you have been alive, and she knows far more about nutrition, food preparation, and your husband's preferences than you will ever learn. But you must pretend to be making decisions, must maintain the fiction that you are managing rather than merely ratifying arrangements made by people with actual competence and authority. This charade of domestic leadership is one of your primary responsibilities as mistress of the house, to provide the appearance of feminine guidance while taking credit for the work of people far more skilled than yourself. Next comes correspondence with various tradespeople, charitable organizations, and social acquaintances. The mail arrives each morning like a tide of obligations, each letter requiring careful attention and appropriate response. Mrs. Pemberton, your husband's aunt, has written to criticize the flowers you selected for last week's dinner party. The vicar's wife has sent a request for your participation in the annual charity bazaar. Lady Ashford wants to know if you can accommodate her nephew during his visit next month. Each letter represents a claim on your time, attention, and energy. Each response must be carefully crafted to maintain appropriate social relationships while avoiding commitments that might conflict with other obligations. Your correspondence consumes hours each day, and virtually none of it involves anything you actually want to write about. The afternoon brings the challenge of social obligations. Today you are expected to pay calls on 3 neighbours, receive 2 ladies who have requested appointments, and prepare for tomorrow's dinner party by reviewing the guest list and ensuring that conversation topics have been properly planned to avoid controversial subjects or awkward social combinations. Paying calls requires another elaborate costume change. The morning dress suitable for household management is inappropriate for social visits, which demand a more formal ensemble that advertises your husband's wealth while maintaining the refined elegance expected of a lady of your station. 20 minutes of Margaret's attention transforms you from household manager to social ornament, ready to be displayed in other people's drawing rooms. The calls themselves follow the same tedious patterns you remember from your unmarried days, except that now you are expected to represent not only yourself, but your husband's social position. Every word you speak reflects on his judgment in selecting you as his wife. Every opinion you express must be carefully calculated to enhance, rather than compromise his standing in the community. At Lady Morrison's, you discuss the weather, the health of mutual acquaintances, and the regrettable tendency of the lower classes to demand higher wages, despite their obvious lack of qualification for such presumption. At Mrs. Ashworth's, you admire her new wallpaper, compliment her daughter's piano playing, and agree that the recent sermons by the new curate show promising moral seriousness. At Lady Whitmore's, you accept an invitation to next week's charity luncheon, offer to contribute preserves for the church bazaar, and listen to detailed complaints about her gardener's insufficient attention to the rose beds. These conversations require the same performance of engaged interest that you perfected during your unmarried days. But now the stakes are higher. Your social failures would reflect not only on your own reputation, but on your husband's judgment and your family's breeding. You must be charming without being forward, intelligent without being opinionated, and interested without being intrusive. The ladies you visit are engaged in identical performances, each one representing her husband's position, while maintaining her own social standing through careful attention to the complex rules governing aristocratic interaction. You are all playing roles in an elaborate theatrical production that has been running for generations, with scripts written by social convention and performances evaluated by an audience of peers who are simultaneously fellow actors in the same endless drama. When you return to Pemberton Hall, you find that your husband has returned from his day's activities. Estate management, political meetings, social obligations of his own, and expects to find his household operating with the same precision as a well-maintained timepiece. Dinner must be perfectly prepared and elegantly served. The drawing room must be arranged for post-dinner conversation. The evening's entertainment must be planned to his satisfaction. Lord Pemberton does not inquire about your day's activities because he assumes, correctly, that you have spent your time fulfilling the domestic and social obligations appropriate to your position. Your thoughts, feelings, and personal experiences are no more relevant to his calculations than the private lives of the servants who maintain his comfort. You exist to enhance his life, not to burden him with the details of your own existence. Dinner conversation revolves around his activities, his concerns, and his plans for the future. He discusses estate improvements that will require significant financial investment, political developments that affect his business interests, and social obligations that will demand your participation as his representative wife. You contribute appropriate responses, expressions of interest in his projects, agreement with his opinions, questions designed to demonstrate your attention to his concerns. After dinner, you retire to the drawing room where you provide decorative accompaniment to his evening's relaxation. Perhaps you play the piano while he reads his newspaper, or work on embroidery while he reviews business correspondence, or engage in light conversation while he enjoys his brandy and cigar. Your role is to be available for his entertainment without demanding attention for your own interests or concerns. This is your life now. This is the domestic paradise that Victorian society insists represents the highest achievement of feminine existence. You have security, comfort, social position, and the satisfaction of fulfilling your natural destiny as wife and household manager. You should be grateful for such advantages, content with such blessings, and fulfilled by such meaningful responsibilities. Instead, you find yourself wondering if the servants might not have more interesting lives than you do. At least their work serves obvious practical purposes. At least they can see the results of their labor. At least they have some prospect of advancement, some possibility of change, some hope that their circumstances might improve through their own efforts. You, meanwhile, have achieved the pinnacle of feminine success and discovered that it consists of an elaborate system of meaningless activities designed to consume time until death provides blessed relief. You are living in luxury while serving a life sentence of elegant uselessness, maintained in comfort while being systematically prevented from accomplishing anything more significant than the perfect arrangement of drawing room furniture. But such thoughts are ungrateful, inappropriate, and possibly evidence of the kind of mental instability that sometimes affects women who fail to find adequate satisfaction in their natural domestic sphere. Good wives do not question their circumstances. Good wives find fulfillment in serving others. Good wives understand that their happiness lies in making other people comfortable, not in pursuing selfish personal ambitions. You are clearly not as good a wife as you should be, but you are trapped in the role nonetheless, and the domestic machinery of Pemberton Hall will continue to operate according to its established routines, whether you find them meaningful or not. The golden cage is very comfortable indeed. The bars are made of silk and social convention rather than iron, but they are no less effective at preventing escape. And unlike prisoners in actual jails, you are expected to be grateful for your confinement and to regard your jailer as your protector and benefactor. Welcome to marriage, darling. Try not to think too much about what you might have been if you had been born with different chromosomes and different social expectations. Such thoughts serve no useful purpose and only make the beautiful prison seem more confining than it actually is. After all, what more could any reasonable woman want than comfort, security, and the opportunity to spend her entire life making other people's lives more pleasant? Surely that is satisfaction enough for any feminine heart. Surely. Just when you thought you had mapped the full extent of your beautiful prison, Victorian society springs its final trap: motherhood. Not the maternal instinct that might naturally develop between a woman and her children, but motherhood as a social institution designed to provide the ultimate justification for feminine subordination, while ensuring that the next generation of women will be equally well prepared for lives of decorative uselessness. The announcement of your pregnancy is greeted with a kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for military victories or religious miracles. Your husband receives congratulations on his virility and the prospect of securing the family succession. Your mother weeps with joy at the thought of grandchildren who will carry on the bloodline. Society ladies vie to offer advice on the proper management of your delicate condition. You, meanwhile, discover that pregnancy in the Victorian upper classes is treated as a form of fashionable illness requiring months of careful invalidism. The moment your condition becomes apparent, you are transformed from an ornamental wife into an ornamental invalid, requiring constant supervision and protection from any activity that might threaten the precious cargo you are carrying. Dr. Pemberton, no relation to your husband, but possessed of the kind of distinguished grey whiskers that inspire confidence in nervous families, prescribes a regimen of rest, gentle exercise, and complete avoidance of anything that might overstimulate your delicate feminine constitution. Reading is limited to improving literature of a cheerful nature. Physical activity is restricted to slow walks in the garden under careful supervision. Social engagements must be curtailed to prevent exhaustion. The irony is exquisite. At the very moment when you are performing the most fundamentally natural and physically demanding task of which the human body is capable, you are treated as if you were made of spun glass and might shatter at any moment. The robust peasant women who work in your husband's fields manage to bear children while continuing their regular labour, but you, a lady of quality, require 9 months of careful invalidism to accomplish the same biological feat. But pregnancy invalidism serves purposes beyond the merely medical. It establishes your complete dependence on masculine protection during this crucial period, reinforces your identity as a delicate creature requiring constant care, and provides months of practice in the kind of physical helplessness that will characterize your entire future as a mother in Victorian society. The birth itself takes place in an atmosphere of crisis barely controlled by medical authority. Dr. Pemberton arrives with his black bag and his grave expression, followed by the monthly nurse whose primary qualification appears to be her ability to maintain an air of professional competence while treating you like a child who cannot be trusted to understand her own body's processes. Your husband, naturally, is banished from the proceedings. Birth is women's work, mysterious and slightly distasteful, requiring feminine management under masculine medical supervision. He spends the ordeal pacing in his study, drinking brandy, and receiving periodic reports on your progress, like a general receiving dispatches from a distant battlefield. The pain is extraordinary, of course, but you are expected to bear it with the stoic resignation appropriate to a lady of quality. Screaming is permitted, even expected, but complaints about the process are considered unseemly. This is your natural feminine destiny, after all, the biological purpose for which your entire existence has been designed. To question the necessity or justice of such suffering would be to question the divine order of things. When your son finally arrives, and naturally it is a son, because the Pemberton bloodline requires male heirs to carry on the family name and inherit the estate, the celebration is immediate and overwhelming. Your husband bursts into the room with tears of joy. The servants are given extra wages in honour of the occasion, and telegrams are dispatched to announce the good news to family and friends throughout England. You, meanwhile, lie exhausted and torn in your blood-stained bed. wondering why everyone is congratulating you for successfully completing a biological process that women have been managing without fanfare for thousands of years. But such practical considerations are irrelevant to the social significance of what has just occurred. You have produced an heir, fulfilled your primary function as a wife, and earned the gratitude of a husband whose family line will continue into the next generation. The lying-in period that follows is another masterpiece of Victorian feminine invalidism. For 6 weeks, you are confined to your bedroom like a criminal under house arrest, attended by the monthly nurse whose authority over your daily routine exceeds that of everyone except Dr. Pemberton himself. You are not permitted to leave your bed for the first week, not allowed to walk beyond your bedroom for the second week, and not authorized to resume normal activities until the doctor certifies that your recovery is complete. During this period of enforced helplessness, you are expected to bond with your infant son while remaining completely ignorant of the practical aspects of child care. The monthly nurse manages feeding schedules, changing, bathing, and all the other routine tasks required to keep a baby alive and healthy. Your role is to provide appropriately maternal sentiment while remaining safely insulated from anything resembling actual responsibility. When you finally emerge from your lying-in, you discover that motherhood has not increased your authority so much as multiplied your responsibilities while maintaining your essential powerlessness. You are now accountable for the proper development of a human being whose daily care is managed by professionals, whose education will be directed by tutors and schools, and whose future will be determined by social expectations over which you have no control. The nursery at Pemberton Hall is a marvel of Victorian child rearing philosophy, a suite of rooms designed to keep children safely isolated from adult life while ensuring their proper development according to the most advanced theories of educational science. Your son spends his days in this domestic laboratory under the supervision of Nurse Morrison, a formidable woman whose credentials include 20 years of experience managing the offspring of aristocratic families. Nurse Morrison's methods are based on the latest scientific understanding of child development, which holds that children require strict scheduling, minimal emotional indulgence, and careful protection from the corrupting influences of excessive affection. Your son is fed at precisely scheduled intervals, regardless of his apparent hunger. He is put to sleep according to rigid timetables, regardless of his inclination to remain awake. He is bathed, dressed, and exercised according to professional routines designed to promote optimal physical and mental development. Your role in this scientific child rearing process is to provide appropriate maternal supervision without interfering with professional management. You are permitted, indeed expected, to spend scheduled time with your son each day, but these visits must be carefully managed to ensure that maternal sentiment does not disrupt the educational routine that Nurse Morrison has established. The daily schedule allows for 1 hour of maternal interaction in the morning and another hour in the late afternoon, during which you are encouraged to engage in appropriately educational activities, reading improving stories, teaching simple songs, and providing the kind of gentle moral guidance that mothers are naturally qualified to offer. Beyond these scheduled visits, your son remains in the professional care of people far more qualified than yourself to manage the complex task of raising a future gentleman. You find this arrangement both insulting and heartbreaking. Your own maternal instincts suggest that children might benefit from more contact with their mothers, more flexibility in their routines, and more attention to their individual personalities and preferences. But such instincts are considered scientifically unreliable, potentially harmful to proper development, and evidence of the kind of emotional excess that makes women unsuitable for serious responsibility. The result is that you become a visitor in your own child's life, permitted to observe his development, but not to direct it, expected to love him, but not to indulge him, required to take responsibility for his character while being denied authority over his daily experience. It is motherhood as social performance rather than biological relationship, parenting as another form of ornamental responsibility that advertises your feminine virtue while ensuring your continued dependence on professional expertise. As your son grows older, the distance between you only increases. At age 5, he is transferred from the nursery to the schoolroom, where his education begins in earnest under the direction of Mr. Fitzpatrick, a tutor whose qualifications include degrees from Oxford and experience preparing young gentlemen for their future roles as leaders of society. Your maternal influence is now limited to scheduled visits and the kind of moral guidance that ladies are considered qualified to provide. Mr. Fitzpatrick's curriculum is designed to prepare your son for Eton, Oxford, an eventual assumption of his father's responsibilities as landowner, investor, and member of Parliament. He studies Latin and Greek, mathematics and natural philosophy, history and literature, all the subjects that will qualify him for masculine authority in adult life. His education is serious, demanding, and carefully designed to develop the intellectual capabilities required for leadership and independence. You, meanwhile, are expected to provide supplementary instruction in the social graces, moral refinement, and religious sentiment that will make him a gentleman as well as a scholar. You teach him to dance, to make polite conversation, to appreciate music and art, and to treat ladies with the courtesy appropriate to their delicate nature. Your educational contribution consists of the ornamental accomplishments that will make him charming without being frivolous, cultured without being intellectual. The irony is not lost on you that your son is receiving exactly the kind of serious, practical education that was denied to you because of your gender. He will learn to think critically, to manage complex affairs, to make independent decisions, and to exercise authority over other people's lives. He will be prepared for a world of meaningful work, genuine responsibility, and authentic achievement. You, his mother, possess none of these qualifications and will never be permitted to develop them. Your son will outgrow your intellectual capacity by the time he reaches adolescence, will surpass your practical knowledge before he leaves for university, and will assume authority over your own life when he inherits his father's estate and becomes your legal guardian in widowhood. This is the ultimate achievement of Victorian feminine existence. See, to raise sons who will be everything you were prevented from becoming, while raising daughters who will be exactly as limited and useless as yourself. You are perpetuating a system that has stunted your own development while ensuring that the next generation of women will be equally well prepared for lives of beautiful, educated, accomplished helplessness. But motherhood, according to Victorian wisdom, is supposed to provide the ultimate fulfillment of feminine nature. The love of children is supposed to compensate for all the restrictions and limitations of women's lives. Maternal sentiment is supposed to make up for intellectual starvation, social subordination, and the systematic prevention of independent achievement. Perhaps it does, for some women. Perhaps there are mothers who find complete satisfaction in loving children they are not permitted to raise, in preparing sons for opportunities they themselves will never have, in teaching daughters to accept limitations they themselves have learned to endure with grace. You are not one of those mothers. You love your children with the fierce protectiveness of someone who recognizes that they are both the greatest joy and the final trap of your existence. You want desperately to protect them from the constraints that have defined your own life, while knowing that you lack the power to offer them anything different from what society has already determined they will become. Your son will escape these limitations because he is male. Your daughter, born 2 years after her brother, will inherit them because she is female. And you, their mother, will spend the rest of your life watching this process unfold with the helpless knowledge that your love, however fierce, is insufficient to change the fundamental inequalities that have shaped your own existence and will shape theirs. This is maternal fulfillment in the Victorian age, to love your children while being systematically prevented from protecting them from the very system that produced you. To want the best for them while lacking the authority to define what best might mean. To be responsible for their characters while being denied control over their circumstances. It is the cruelest joke of all that the institution of motherhood, which promises to give meaning and purpose to women's constrained lives, actually serves to ensure that those constraints will be passed on to the next generation with the full cooperation of the women who have suffered under them. You are not just a prisoner in your golden cage. You are a guard, ensuring that the next generation of inmates will be properly prepared for their own beautiful confinement, The bars are made of love, and they are stronger than iron. 20. 5 years have passed since you first entered London society as a fresh-faced debutante, and you have become exactly what that system designed you to become. A perfect specimen of Victorian womanhood, accomplished in all the arts of ornamental existence, expert in all the skills of beautiful uselessness. You are now 30, 8 years old, which in Victorian terms makes you a mature matron, whose primary social function has shifted from being decorative to ensuring that the next generation of young ladies are properly prepared for their own decorative careers. Your life has settled into the rhythms of established social success. You have fulfilled all the expectations placed upon you with exemplary competence, produced the required heirs, managed your household with appropriate efficiency, maintained your husband's social position with suitable dignity, and prepared your daughter for her own entry into the marriage market. By every measure that Victorian society considers important, you are a triumphant success. Yet you wake each morning with the growing certainty that you have spent your entire adult life performing in a play whose plot you despise, speaking lines you never chose, playing a character whose motivations remain completely mysterious to you. The performance has become so natural, so automatic, that you sometimes forget there was ever a person beneath the role. But in quiet moments, rare and dangerous moments when the social machinery pauses long enough for reflection, you remember that somewhere inside this perfectly accomplished lady is a woman who once had thoughts, dreams, and ambitions that extended beyond the arrangement of drawing room furniture and the planning of dinner parties. The morning routine has become a ritual of self-erasure. Margaret, now grey-haired, and even more devoted to the maintenance of your public persona, still begins each day by transforming you from whatever semblance of natural humanity might have emerged during sleep into the polished artifice that Victorian society demands. The process has become more elaborate over the years, requiring increasingly complex architectural interventions to maintain the illusion of youth and vitality. The corset now serves not merely to create an impossible silhouette, but to hold together a body that shows signs of wear from 20 years of restricted breathing, minimal nutrition, and enforced physical helplessness. The cosmetics are more numerous and more carefully applied, designed to conceal the effects of chronic exhaustion, social strain, and the kind of spiritual depletion that comes from decades of meaningless activity. Your wardrobe has evolved to reflect your elevated social position. The morning dress alone represents more wealth than most families see in several years, crafted from fabrics imported from across the empire and sewn by seamstresses whose skills rival those of artists. Every detail proclaims your husband's prosperity, your family's refinement, and your own successful adaptation to the requirements of aristocratic femininity. But the clothes feel heavier now, more burdensome, like elaborate chains designed by master craftsmen who understand that the most effective prisons are those that appear to be privileges. You move through your daily routines with the practiced grace of someone who has learned to make constraint appear natural, restriction seem elegant, and powerlessness look like refinement. The social obligations have multiplied along with your status. As the wife of a man whose political influence has grown over the years, you are expected to entertain on a scale that transforms your home into a semi-public space where important business is conducted under the guise of social pleasure. The dinner parties that once accommodated 12 now require arrangements for 30 or 40 guests, each event a complex diplomatic operation disguised as gracious hospitality. The guest lists alone require strategic planning worthy of military campaigns. Political alliances must be balanced against social hierarchies. Business relationships must be maintained without creating awkward personal combinations. Family obligations must be honored, while avoiding the kind of controversial associations that might damage your husband's carefully cultivated reputation. You have become expert in the subtle arts of social manipulation, capable of managing conversations to avoid dangerous topics, directing attention away from potential conflicts, and ensuring that every gathering reinforces the complex web of relationships that maintains your family's position in society. These skills are considerable and genuinely impressive, but they serve no purpose beyond the maintenance of a social system that treats you as a beautiful hostess rather than a thinking human being. The irony is that you have developed genuine expertise in areas where your opinions are never consulted. You understand political dynamics better than many of the men who make political decisions. Having observed their negotiations, listened to their private conversations, and witnessed the gap between their public positions and their private calculations, you have insights into social and economic trends that would be valuable to anyone interested in understanding how Victorian society actually functions. But your knowledge remains decorative rather than functional. You are expected to demonstrate your understanding through the graceful management of social situations rather than the expression of independent analysis. Your intelligence serves to make you a more effective hostess, not to qualify you for participation in the decisions that shape the world you live in. The charitable work that now consumes much of your time represents the closest thing to meaningful activity that Victorian society permits to women of your class. You serve on the boards of several organisations dedicated to improving the conditions of the deserving poor, managing orphanages for children of fallen women, and providing moral instruction to working class families whose poverty is presumed to result from deficiencies of character rather than systemic inequalities. This charitable work is simultaneously the most and least satisfying aspect of your current existence. Most satisfying because it involves genuine problems requiring practical solutions, real suffering that your efforts might actually alleviate, and work that produces measurable results beyond the mere arrangement of social appearances. Least satisfying because your role is carefully circumscribed to exclude anything resembling serious analysis of the causes of poverty or meaningful criticism of the social arrangements that produce such widespread misery. You are permitted to provide charity, but not to question why charity is necessary. You may organize soup kitchens, but not ask why so many people cannot afford food. You can establish schools for working class children, but must not examine why their parents lack the education and opportunities that might lift them from poverty. Your charitable efforts must focus on moral improvement and personal responsibility while avoiding any suggestion that broader social reforms might be necessary. The meetings of the Ladies' Charitable Society follow patterns as rigid as those governing drawing room conversations. Lady Pemberton presides with the authority of someone whose husband's political position makes her opinions particularly weighty. Mrs. Ashworth manages the financial accounts with the efficiency of someone whose family's banking connections provide useful expertise. You coordinate the practical arrangements with the organizational skills you have developed through years of managing complex household operations. The work itself is genuinely important. The orphanage you help supervise provides food, shelter, and basic education to children who would otherwise face starvation or worse. The soup kitchen serves hundreds of meals each week to families struggling with unemployment, illness, or the simple mathematics of survival on inadequate wages. The moral instruction classes offer working class women practical advice about household management, childcare, and the cultivation of Christian virtues that might improve their family's circumstances. But the philosophical framework within which this charity operates ensures that your efforts, however well-intentioned, serve to reinforce rather than challenge the social arrangements that create the problems you are trying to address. The poor are assumed to be poor because of moral failings, laziness, drunkenness, improvidence, or simple lack of proper Christian values. The solution is therefore moral education rather than economic reform, individual improvement rather than systemic change. You are not permitted to observe that many of the families seeking charity are headed by men who work 12-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that barely support survival, much less moral improvement. You cannot mention that many of the women in your moral instruction classes are more knowledgeable about practical household management than you will ever be, having learned efficiency from necessity rather than theory. You must not suggest that the widespread poverty you encounter might result from economic policies that concentrate wealth among people like your husband while leaving working families to scramble for the remnants. Such observations would mark you as dangerously radical, unsuited for charitable work, and possibly influenced by the kind of socialist agitation that threatens the stability of civilized society. Good Christian ladies provide charity from a sense of noblesse oblige while maintaining proper respect for the social order that makes such charity necessary. They help the deserving poor improve their moral condition without questioning why so many people deserve to be poor in the first place. Nevertheless, the charitable work provides you with glimpses of a world beyond drawing rooms and dinner parties, contact with people whose lives are shaped by genuine challenges rather than social obligations, an experience of problems that require practical solutions rather than ornamental responses. Working with the Ladies' Charitable Society is the closest you will ever come to meaningful work, and you treasure these opportunities even while recognizing their limitations. Your daughter Charlotte, now 16 and preparing for her own debut into society, watches your charitable activities with the same mixture of admiration and puzzlement that you once felt observing your own mother's good works. She has inherited your intelligence along with your beauty, and she possesses the same dangerous tendency toward independent thought that you have learned to suppress in yourself. Mama, she asks during one of your increasingly rare moments of private conversation, why do we provide charity to the poor instead of simply paying working people wages adequate to support their families? The question strikes you like a physical blow, not because it is inappropriate, though it certainly is, but because it articulates thoughts you have been carefully avoiding for years. Charlotte has identified the fundamental contradiction that makes charitable work both necessary and ultimately futile. You are treating symptoms while ignoring causes, providing temporary relief while maintaining the conditions that create ongoing need. My dear, you respond with the automatic wisdom that years of social training have made reflexive. We must be grateful for our advantages and use them to help those less fortunate. It is not our place to question the arrangements that Providence has established, but rather to demonstrate Christian charity toward those who struggle with their appointed circumstances. Even as you speak the words, you recognize them as the same empty formulations that were offered to you at Charlotte's age. It's the same circular logic that prevents intelligent women from examining the social arrangements that constrain their own lives. You are perpetuating the intellectual imprisonment that has defined your own existence, teaching your daughter to accept limitations that you have never had the courage to challenge directly. Charlotte listens with the polite attention that good daughters owe to maternal wisdom, but you can see in her eyes the same restless intelligence that once characterized your own thoughts before social conditioning taught you to suppress such dangerous clarity. She will learn, as you learned, to ask safer questions and accept approved answers. She will develop the same skills of intellectual self-censorship that have made you such a successful specimen of Victorian womanhood. The process has already begun. Charlotte's education follows the same pattern that shaped your own intellectual development. Accomplishments designed to make her attractive to potential husbands, cultural refinements that will demonstrate her family's good breeding, and carefully selected knowledge that will allow her to make intelligent conversation without developing inconvenient opinions about the world she lives in. Her governess, Miss Thompson, is a younger version of the woman who trained you for ornamental existence. She possesses the same unshakable belief in the wisdom of limiting feminine education to safe subjects, the same conviction that too much learning might unfit young ladies for their natural domestic destinies, and the same talent for making intellectual restriction appear to be protective guidance. Charlotte studies French and German, watercolor painting and piano, literature and history, all filtered through the same lens of moral improvement and social refinement that characterized your own education. She is learning to be accomplished without being independent, cultured without being critical, intelligent enough to appreciate her advantages, and not quite intelligent enough to question the system that provides them. You watch this process with the helpless knowledge of someone who has traveled the same path and knows exactly where it leads. Charlotte will make her debut, attract suitable suitors, marry advantageously, and settle into the same life of beautiful uselessness that has defined your own existence. She will bear children she is not permitted to raise, manage households she cannot control, and participate in charitable work that addresses problems she is forbidden to analyze. The cycle will continue with the mechanical precision of a very expensive and very beautiful clock. Each generation of women perfectly prepared for lives of elegant confinement, each daughter trained to accept the limitations that her mother learned to endure with grace. Your son Charles, meanwhile, prepares for Oxford with the confidence of someone whose future offers genuine choices and meaningful opportunities. At 19, he already possesses more practical authority than you will ever achieve, more intellectual freedom than you have ever experienced, and more realistic prospects for independent achievement than any woman of your class can imagine. The contrast between your children's futures encapsulates the fundamental inequality that shapes Victorian society. Charles will inherit everything: property, authority, opportunity, and the assumption that his thoughts and preferences matter in the world beyond domestic arrangements. Charlotte will inherit nothing except the opportunity to marry someone who possesses the advantages denied to her by virtue of her gender. Yet both of them have been raised to consider this arrangement natural, just, and divinely ordained. Charles accepts his privileges as the obvious result of his masculine superiority. Charlotte accepts her limitations as the inevitable consequence of her feminine nature. Neither questions a system that distributes opportunities and restrictions according to biological characteristics rather than individual merit or preference. You have been complicit in teaching them these lessons, just as your own parents were complicit in teaching them to you. The Victorian system of gender inequality perpetuates itself not through force, but through the willing cooperation of women who have been convinced that their subordination serves higher purposes: family stability, social order, and the proper functioning of civilized society. The tragedy is not that you have been unhappy, though you have been profoundly and consistently unhappy in ways that polite society does not permit you to acknowledge. The tragedy is that you have been happy enough, comfortable enough, and sufficiently protected from the worst forms of suffering to accept your beautiful prison as a reasonable arrangement. You have lived a life of considerable privilege, genuine comfort, and relative security. You have been spared the poverty, violence, and desperation that characterize the lives of working-class women. You have enjoyed luxury, refinement, and social position that millions of people will never experience. But you have also been systematically prevented from discovering what you might have become if you had been permitted to develop your capabilities, pursue your interests, and exercise your intelligence in ways that extended beyond the arrangement of social appearances. You have been protected from suffering while being denied the opportunity for genuine achievement, sheltered from hardship while being excluded from meaningful work. Looking back over 25 years of adult life, you struggle to identify accomplishments that extended beyond the successful performance of social roles. You have been an excellent wife, devoted mother, gracious hostess, and dedicated participant in charitable work. You have fulfilled every expectation placed upon you with exemplary competence. Yet you cannot escape the suspicion that a life spent meeting other people's expectations, while systematically ignoring your own preferences and capabilities, represents a form of waste so profound that it constitutes a crime against human potential. You have been given intelligence, education, and opportunity, and you have used these gifts to perfect the arts of ornamental existence, while remaining ignorant of your own authentic interests and abilities. The woman you might have become remains forever unknown, not only to the world but to yourself. You will never know what you might have accomplished if you had been permitted to try, what problems you might have solved if you had been allowed to engage with them seriously, what contributions you might have made if society had recognized you as something more than a decorative accessory to masculine achievement. This is the final cruelty of the Victorian system. It does not simply limit women's opportunities, but ensures that women themselves will never know what opportunities they might have seized if they had been permitted to try. You have been denied not only achievement, but even the knowledge of what you might have achieved. The golden cage has been so perfectly constructed that its inmates learn to sing beautifully, while forgetting that they were ever meant to fly. You are 45 years old now, and the elaborate machinery of your Victorian existence continues to operate with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Each day unfolds according to patterns established decades ago. Each season brings the same social obligations and domestic responsibilities. Each year passes in a blur of activities that consume enormous amounts of time and energy while producing nothing more lasting than the temporary arrangement of social appearances. But something has shifted in the carefully maintained equilibrium of your beautiful prison. Perhaps it is the death of your mother-in-law, which finally removed the last authority figure who might have enforced your complete submission to social expectations. Perhaps it is the growing independence of your children, which has freed you from the immediate demands of maternal performance. Or perhaps it is simply the accumulation of years spent in increasingly desperate service to social conventions that have never made sense to you. Whatever the cause, you find yourself experiencing moments of dangerous clarity, periods when the absurdity of your existence becomes so obvious that you wonder how you have managed to ignore it for so long. The elaborate rituals of dress and deportment that once seemed natural now feel like theatrical performances in a play whose plot has been forgotten by everyone except the actors. The social obligations that once provided structure for your days now seem like meaningless ceremonies dedicated to gods in whom no one actually believes. The change began subtly, with small rebellions that probably passed unnoticed by anyone except yourself. You started spending longer periods in the library, reading books that had nothing to do with appropriate feminine interests. You began taking solitary walks in the garden, precious moments of genuine privacy that violated the social convention requiring ladies to be constantly supervised and entertained. You found yourself asking questions during charitable work meetings, questions that pushed against the boundaries of acceptable feminine curiosity about social problems. These minor infractions felt extraordinarily dangerous, like acts of rebellion against the fundamental order of the universe. You had been so thoroughly trained in the requirements of feminine propriety that even the smallest deviations from expected behavior triggered anxiety responses that suggested you might be risking everything you had spent your adult life building. But the infractions also felt exhilarating in ways that nothing had felt exhilarating for decades. Reading philosophy without worrying about whether it was appropriate for feminine minds gave you the same thrill you remembered from childhood adventures before social conditioning taught you that curiosity was dangerous and independent thought was unfeminine. Walking alone in the garden, without the constant presence of companions or servants, provided a kind of mental space you had almost forgotten could exist. These small freedoms made you realize how completely your life had been choreographed by other people's expectations, how thoroughly your daily existence had been structured to serve purposes that had nothing to do with your own preferences or interests. You began to understand that you had spent 25 years performing the role of yourself rather than actually living your own life. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggested that the constraints you had accepted as natural and inevitable were actually artificial constructions that might be questioned or even challenged. Terrifying because questioning those constraints implied the possibility of alternatives you were not sure you had the courage to pursue. Your husband has begun to notice your increasing tendency toward what he politely terms philosophical reflection. Lord Pemberton interprets your new intellectual interests as a symptom of the mental instability that sometimes affects women of a certain age, a condition that Victorian medical wisdom attributes to the natural deterioration of feminine emotional equilibrium as reproductive capacity declines. "My dear," he announced over breakfast one morning, after observing you reading a book about political economy rather than the fashion magazines or devotional literature that had previously occupied your attention, perhaps Dr. Pemberton should examine you. This recent preoccupation with serious subjects suggests a nervous condition that might benefit from professional attention. The suggestion that your intellectual curiosity constituted a medical problem requiring treatment struck you as so perfectly representative of the wrong with Victorian attitudes toward women that you actually laughed out loud. A response that alarmed yours even more than you'll have of them nor the more your reading habits. "I assure you, my lord, that my interest in understanding the world around me represents robust mental health rather than nervous decline," you replied, using a tone of voice that probably violated several important rules about appropriate feminine deference to masculine authority. Lord Pemberton's expression suggested that your response confirmed his suspicions about your deteriorating mental condition. In his experience, women who questioned medical opinion, particularly medical opinion supported by their husband's concerns, were demonstrating exactly the kind of intellectual arrogance that indicated serious psychological problems. The conversation marked a turning point in your marriage, though perhaps not the kind of turning point that either of you anticipated. Your husband's assumption that intellectual curiosity constituted mental illness made you realize how completely he had always regarded you as an ornamental dependent rather than a thinking human being. His immediate recourse to medical authority, when confronted with evidence of your independent mental activity, revealed the extent to which your entire marriage had been predicated on your intellectual submission. For the first time in 25 years, you found yourself wondering what might have happened if you had refused Lord Pemberton's proposal, if you had insisted on remaining unmarried rather than accepting the comfortable prison of aristocratic wifehood. The question was dangerous because it implied that you had once possessed choices that you had voluntarily surrendered, that your current constraints resulted partly from your own decisions rather than entirely from forces beyond your control. But dangerous questions, you were discovering, became easier to ask once you started asking them. If intellectual curiosity was not a symptom of mental illness, what other supposedly natural limitations might actually be artificial constructions? If women were capable of understanding political economy, what other subjects might they be capable of mastering? If your dissatisfaction with ornamental existence was not evidence of feminine inadequacy, what might it suggest about the adequacy of the social arrangements that required such ornamental performance? You began to seek out information about the world beyond your immediate social circle, partly from genuine curiosity and partly from a growing suspicion that your education had been deliberately designed to keep you ignorant of alternatives to your current existence. The library at Pemberton Hall contained books that you had never been encouraged to read, works of philosophy, political theory, and social criticism that had been deemed inappropriate for feminine attention. Reading these forbidden texts was like discovering a parallel universe where people took seriously questions that your social circle had taught you to dismiss as either unimportant or already settled by higher authorities. Political philosophers discussed the sources of governmental legitimacy as if such matters were open to rational analysis rather than determined by divine appointment. Social critics examined economic arrangements as if they were human institutions that might be reformed rather than natural laws that must be accepted. Most shocking of all, you discovered writers who questioned the subordination of women as if it were a social convention rather than a biological necessity. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman suggested that feminine intellectual inferiority was the result of inadequate education rather than natural incapacity. John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women argued that legal and social constraints on women served no legitimate purpose beyond the preservation of masculine privilege. These ideas were so radical, so completely contrary to everything you had been taught about the natural order of society, that reading them felt like a form of intellectual treason. Yet they also provided explanations for your own experience that made more sense than the official wisdom you had been offered throughout your life. Perhaps your dissatisfaction with ornamental existence did not indicate feminine inadequacy, but rather suggested that human beings, regardless of gender, required meaningful work and genuine purpose to achieve psychological health. Perhaps your intellectual curiosity was not a symptom of mental instability, but evidence of capabilities that had been systematically suppressed by social arrangements designed to maintain masculine authority. Perhaps the beautiful prison that had contained your entire adult life was not the natural habitat of feminine nature, but an artificial construction designed to serve interests that had nothing to do with your own well-being or development. These possibilities were simultaneously thrilling and devastating. Thrilling because they suggested that your long, suppressed sense that something was fundamentally wrong with your life had been accurate rather than pathological. Devastating because they implied that you had wasted decades accepting limitations that might have been challenged. submitting to restrictions that served no legitimate purpose, and performing roles that had prevented you from discovering your own authentic interests and capabilities. The woman you might have become if you had been permitted to develop your intelligence, pursue your curiosity, and exercise your capabilities in meaningful work remained forever unknowable. But for the first time in your adult life, you could at least imagine that such a woman might have existed, might have accomplished things worth accomplishing, might have experienced the kind of satisfaction that comes from genuine achievement rather than successful performance of social expectations. Your daughter Charlotte, now 18 and in the midst of her own debut season, has begun to notice your intellectual transformation with the same mixture of curiosity and alarm that characterized your husband's response. She approaches you one afternoon while you are reading in the library, her expression suggesting that she wants to discuss something more serious than the usual topics that dominate conversations between mothers and daughters in your social circle. "Mama," she begins hesitantly, "Lady Ashford mentioned that you have been asking unusual questions during the charitable society meetings. She suggested that perhaps you have been reading inappropriate books that have given you strange ideas about women's proper role in society. The conversation presents you with a choice that will define not only your own future, but possibly your daughter's as well. You can provide the reassuring response that social convention demands, dismissing your intellectual interests as temporary diversions that will not interfere with your continued performance of appropriate feminine roles. Or you can tell Charlotte the truth about what you have discovered, sharing insights that might help her avoid the beautiful trap that has consumed your own life. The first option is safer, more socially acceptable, and more consistent with your responsibilities as a mother in Victorian society. The second option is dangerous, potentially destructive to your daughter's social prospects, and certain to be interpreted as evidence of the mental instability that your husband already suspects. But looking at Charlotte's intelligent face, seeing in her expression the same restless curiosity that once characterized your own thoughts before social conditioning taught you to suppress such dangerous tendencies, you realize that you cannot bear to watch another generation of women accept limitations that serve no legitimate purpose beyond the maintenance of masculine privilege. "My darling," you begin, choosing words that will change both of your lives forever. "I have indeed been reading books that have helped me understand some important truths about the world we live in. And I think it is time that you understood these truths as well, so that you can make informed decisions about the life you want to live." What follows is the most honest conversation you have ever had with another human being, a discussion that violates every rule governing appropriate feminine behavior while providing your daughter with information that might actually be useful for making decisions about her own future. You tell her about the artificial nature of feminine intellectual limitations, the economic and political arrangements that make women's dependence necessary for masculine authority, and the possibility that different social arrangements might allow women to develop their capabilities and pursue their interests in ways that extend beyond ornamental performance. Charlotte listens with the fascination of someone discovering that the world is far more complex and interesting than she had been taught to believe. She asks questions that demonstrate both her intelligence and her growing understanding of the constraints that have shaped her own education and social expectations. By the end of the conversation, both of you understand that you have crossed a line from which there may be no return. You have shared knowledge that makes continued acceptance of traditional feminine roles psychologically impossible. You have planted seeds of intellectual rebellion that will make successful performance of social expectations increasingly difficult. You have also given your daughter the greatest gift you are capable of providing, the knowledge that she possesses choices, even if those choices involve risks and sacrifices that previous generations of women were not required to consider. The beautiful prison remains locked, but for the first time in your adult life, you can see the bars clearly. And perhaps, with enough courage and sufficient determination, you might even find ways to bend them. 5 years have passed since that transformative conversation with Charlotte, and the consequences of your intellectual awakening have rippled through your life in ways that you could never have anticipated. The careful equilibrium that once characterized your existence has been permanently disturbed, replaced by a constant tension between the social roles you are still expected to perform and the growing certainty that those roles serve no legitimate purpose beyond the maintenance of a system that treats half of humanity as decorative accessories to the other half. You are 50 years old now, which in Victorian terms places you firmly in the category of women whose primary social value has shifted from reproductive potential to the wisdom that supposedly comes with age and experience. The irony is exquisite. Society finally permits you to have opinions precisely at the point when you have accumulated enough knowledge to recognize how completely meaningless most socially acceptable opinions actually are. Your marriage has not survived your intellectual transformation intact. Lord Pemberton, confronted with a wife who questions his authority and refuses to provide the unquestioning admiration that he had learned to expect, has retreated into the kind of cold formality that Victorian gentlemen employ when dealing with women who have proven themselves unsuitable for the roles society assigned them. He treats you with the polite distance he might show to a slightly disreputable relative whose presence must be tolerated, but whose influence must be carefully contained. The distance suits you perfectly. For the first time in your adult life, you are not required to provide constant emotional labor for a man who regards your thoughts and feelings as either irrelevant or actively inconvenient. You have discovered the unexpected pleasure of solitude, the luxury of spending hours without having to consider how your words and actions might affect someone else's comfort or social standing. Your charitable work has evolved into something approaching genuine social activism, though you are careful to frame your efforts in terms that do not completely violate Victorian expectations for feminine behavior. You have established a school for working class girls that provides practical education rather than mere moral instruction, teaching skills that might actually improve their economic prospects rather than simply making them more resigned to poverty. The project has been controversial within the Ladies' Charitable Society, where several members have expressed concern that educating working class girls beyond their natural station might make them dissatisfied with their proper place in society. You have learned to respond to such objections with the kind of gentle reasonableness that makes radical ideas appear to be common sense. Surely, you argue, it serves everyone's interests to ensure that working mothers possess the skills necessary to maintain healthy households and raise children who will become productive members of society. Education that improves their practical capabilities benefits not only their own families but the entire community. The logic is unassailable within the framework of Victorian social philosophy. Even though your actual motivation has nothing to do with community benefit and everything to do with providing working class women with alternatives to lives of grinding poverty and complete dependence on masculine protection. You have learned to be subversive within the constraints of acceptable feminine discourse, advancing genuinely radical goals through arguments that appeal to conventional social values. Charlotte has become your closest collaborator in these efforts, having inherited not only your intelligence, but your growing understanding of the artificial nature of feminine limitations. Her debut season was a carefully managed disaster. She displayed enough social competence to avoid complete disgrace while making it clear to potential suitors that she would not be the kind of wife who enhanced masculine comfort through submissive devotion. The strategy worked exactly as intended. Charlotte received several proposals from men who were either too obtuse to recognize her intellectual independence or confident that marriage would cure her of such inappropriate tendencies. She declined all of them with the polite firmness of someone who had better things to do than spend her life serving as a decorative accessory to masculine ambition. Her decision to remain unmarried has been interpreted by society as either evidence of impossibly high standards or symptoms of the same mental instability that supposedly affects her mother. You prefer to interpret it as evidence that your daughter has learned to value her own intellectual development more highly than social approval. A lesson you wish had learned 30 years earlier. Together, you and Charlotte have begun working on a project that would have been unthinkable during your own youth. a book documenting the experiences of women from various social classes, examining the ways that legal, economic, and social arrangements limit feminine development while serving masculine interests. The work is scholarly in its approach, but accessible in its language, designed to reach women who might benefit from understanding that their personal dissatisfactions reflect systemic problems rather than individual inadequacies. The project requires careful discretion. You publish under pseudonyms, work with publishers who specialize in controversial material, and take care to avoid direct challenges to religious or political authorities that might result in legal consequences. But the work provides the kind of intellectual satisfaction you had never experienced during decades of ornamental existence, the deep pleasure that comes from using your capabilities for purposes that extend beyond the arrangement of social appearances. Your son Charles, now graduated from Oxford and beginning his career in Parliament, regards your intellectual transformation with the bemused tolerance that enlightened men of his generation extend to women whose minds have been unfortunately affected by too much reading. He loves you certainly, but he also considers you a cautionary example of what happens when women are permitted too much intellectual freedom during the vulnerable years of middle age. Charles has married appropriately, a charming young woman whose education and social training prepared her perfectly for the role of ornamental wife and eventual ornamental mother. Watching her navigate the early years of marriage with the same combination of grace and quiet desperation that once characterized your own experience, you feel simultaneously sympathetic and guilty. Sympathetic because you recognize the constraints that shape her daily existence, the carefully maintained performance of feminine contentment that conceals a growing awareness that something fundamental is missing from her beautiful, comfortable, completely meaningless life. Guilty because you wonder whether your own example might have prepared Charles to expect more intellectual submission from his wife, making her situation even more difficult than your own had been. But you resist the impulse to offer guidance that she has not requested. The intellectual awakening that transformed your own life cannot be imposed on other people. It must emerge from their own recognition that the roles they are performing serve no authentic purpose. You content yourself with being available if she should ever need someone who understands the specific challenges of maintaining sanity within the constraints of aristocratic wifehood. Your relationship with the broader social circle that once defined your identity has become increasingly strained. The women who were once your closest friends now regard you with the kind of nervous concern typically reserved for relatives who have developed embarrassing eccentricities that must be managed carefully to avoid social complications. Lady Ashford, in particular, has taken it upon herself to monitor your intellectual activities with the dedication of someone conducting surveillance on behalf of social stability. She reports your reading habits to mutual acquaintances, interprets your charitable work as evidence of dangerous radical sympathies, and generally treats your intellectual development as a form of contagious disease that might spread to other women if not properly contained. You find her concern both amusing and revealing. Lady Ashford's desperate efforts to maintain orthodox feminine behaviour in herself and others suggest an underlying awareness that the system she defends so vigorously might not actually serve women's interests as well as she pretends to believe. Her anxiety about your intellectual independence hints at her own suppressed recognition that alternative ways of living might be possible, even preferable, to the ornamental existence that has defined her own life. The social isolation that results from your intellectual transformation has been surprisingly liberating. Freed from the obligation to maintain relationships based on shared commitment to meaningless social conventions, you have discovered friendships with people whose company you actually enjoy. Other women who have developed intellectual interests that extend beyond the arrangement of drawing room furniture. Men who treat you as a thinking human being rather than a decorative audience for their pronouncements about the world. These relationships are necessarily limited by social conventions that still govern interactions between men and women, married women and unmarried women, people of different social classes. But within those constraints, you have experienced the kind of intellectual companionship that you never knew existed during the decades when your social circle consisted entirely of people whose primary qualification for friendship was their ability to make acceptable conversation while maintaining appropriate ignorance about interesting subjects. Looking back over the transformation that has defined the last 5 years of your life, you feel neither regret for the time you lost to ornamental existence, nor complete satisfaction with the alternatives you have managed to create. The Victorian system of feminine subordination is too thoroughly entrenched, too completely supported by legal, economic, and social arrangements, to be challenged successfully by individual acts of intellectual rebellion. But you have discovered that even within the constraints of that system, possibilities exist for lives that extend beyond the mere performance of social expectations. You have learned that intelligence, curiosity, and the desire for meaningful work are not symptoms of feminine inadequacy, but evidence of human capabilities that transcend the artificial limitations imposed by gender roles. Most importantly, you have provided your daughter with knowledge that might allow her to make informed decisions about the life she wants to live, rather than simply accepting the roles that society has prepared for her. Whether she will be able to create alternatives that extend beyond the boundaries you have managed to establish remains to be seen, but at least she will know that such alternatives are theoretically possible. The golden cage remains locked for most women of your generation and social class. The bars are still made of silk and social convention rather than iron, but they are no less effective at preventing genuine freedom. The system that treats women as decorative accessories to masculine achievement continues to operate with the mechanical precision of a machine designed by people who understand exactly how to make oppression appear to be privilege. But cages, even golden ones, are not natural features of the landscape. They are human constructions built to serve human purposes, and what human beings have built, other human beings might eventually find ways to modify or even dismantle. You will not live to see that liberation, and perhaps your daughter will not live to see it either. But the intellectual seeds that you have planted, the questions that you have learned to ask, the knowledge that you have acquired and shared, these might contribute to changes that extend far beyond the boundaries of your own constrained existence. The woman you might have become if you had been born into different circumstances remains forever unknowable. But the woman you have managed to become within the constraints of Victorian society represents a small victory against a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of intellectual development you have achieved. It is not the life you would have chosen if genuine choices had been available to you, but it is recognizably your life, shaped by your decisions and devoted to purposes that you have selected rather than simply accepted. That, perhaps, is the most that any human being can hope to achieve: to live authentically within whatever constraints history and circumstance have imposed, to use whatever capabilities they possess for purposes that extend beyond their own immediate comfort, and to leave behind some evidence that they existed as thinking, choosing agents rather than merely as performers of roles written by other people. The gilded cage was never meant to be opened, but you have learned to sing your own songs within its beautiful, restrictive confines, and perhaps that music will inspire others to imagine melodies that extend beyond the boundaries of any cage at all. The bars are still there, still strong, still effective at limiting movement and possibility, but they no longer define the full extent of what it means to be human, even when that humanity must be expressed within the constraints of a system designed to deny its very existence. And sometimes, late at night when the social machinery has finally stopped demanding your attention, you can almost hear the sound of other women in other cages, learning to sing their own songs, preparing to teach their own daughters that golden bars, however beautiful, are still only bars. The revolution, when it comes, will not be fought with weapons or proclaimed in manifestos. It will emerge from the accumulated recognition of millions of women that the roles they have been assigned serve no legitimate purpose beyond the maintenance of systems that treat them as ornamental objects rather than autonomous human beings. You will not live to see that revolution, but you have contributed to the intellectual foundations that will make it possible. The beautiful prison that contained your life so completely will not contain your legacy quite so successfully. The golden cage, it turns out, is not quite as permanent as its architects intended it to be. And that, perhaps, is victory enough.